Rajiv, Yorien, and David, I know each of you had a busy Reman week and have also been intimately engaged in other global forums over the past few weeks. A few of the topics that stood out to me this week have included discussion on how to advance remanufacturing in India and other regional economies, further recognition of the critical role that diversity, equity, and inclusion play in helping us support a more diverse and innovative future, particularly in the circular economy and remanufacturing industries. And a focus on pragmatic action, particularly as we look at 2 degrees Celsius and the notion of a global climate accord, what role that remanufacturing has always served, but is now looked at as a pillar of opportunity within the circular economy to really support climate action going forward in a very substantial way. And it's this last point where I'd like to begin with each of us as a nexus for initiating some dialogue here today. When we look at the climate agenda before us and think through the opportunities surrounding remanufacturing and the circular economy, we see these pillars converging. This notion of converging intention through policy, the idea of action-oriented opportunities through innovation in all its forms, and the potential to achieve scale via partnerships, both regional, global, and otherwise. David, if you don't mind, if I could begin with you, could you provide some context in this past week and your efforts in the past few weeks in any of these topics, but particularly if we wanted to begin in on climate, some perspective from you on what you're hearing and seeing.
Good, thanks, Mark. That was a very helpful introduction. And I think that link between product life extension, the life of products, the life cycle of products, and climate change, that link has been made stronger, I think, if we look back to the one study that I would use as the foundation stone. And that is a study that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation did in 2019 with a Scandinavian consultancy called Material Economics. And that study highlighted that 45% of CO2 emissions could be traced back to the life cycle of products. And in doing so, thereby made it clear that the circular economy is an important aspect of our trying to keep within the temperature targets set at the Paris Agreement. So I think that's the first thing. Let's be clear about where the evidence rests for the link between circular economy and the global warming agenda. And if there's one person, I think I would recommend everybody to hear on that issue. And I might need some help from you here, Yorien, on how to pronounce her name, because she's a Dutch minister. She speaks brilliantly on this topic. And it's Stintje van Veldhoven. Now, so come on, did I pronounce that anywhere right?
Yeah, you were okay. You were okay. Yeah, typical Dutch name.
Yeah, difficult Dutch name. But she's a very good speaker, and indeed she is speaking. I think in the next couple of weeks, there's a conference coming up from the World Circular Economy Forum, which is an organization that's led by Sitra in Finland, but they're cooperating with the Dutch government on a conference specifically on this issue, Mark. So I think it's very timely to talk about this, because some people would deny that it's important to talk about the circular economy in the global warming agenda. But I think if you really want to understand why it's important, that conference will cover it in the next couple of weeks. I think it's the 15th and 16th of April. And Stintje van Veldhoven will be introducing the topic. I'd recommend it. Does that help? Get us started.
That's terrific, David. Yeah, it's great to hear. When we think about, the full life cycle of a product and the complement of, design engineering, I know we have talked in the past about embodied energy and the utilization of materials fully throughout a product's life cycle. And this is where I think intention around policy and innovation fit in a great deal as well. in a sense, we have the capability and the knowledge to really bring forward, again, more holistic thinking around the carbon cycle, and that the utilization of a product in many forms can be designed in on the front end, and the capability for us to bring that wisdom and knowledge into engineering organizations, manufacturing organizations, educational institutions, so that we can more fully understand where carbon is consumed, where carbon may be dispensed within a product's life cycle, and think through ways that we can fully capture that. Obviously, in my mind, become really quite part of our toolkit here across many industries. And remanufacturing, I believe, just puts a finer point or lens to that, because there's an inherent desire to extend product life and also look at that embodied material and energy component in a very utilitarian way, for improving resource efficiency.
I also believe that. I think David gave a good example of how Europe is doing at the moment, and I think Europe is quite leading in the circular economy, especially in their agenda, like how they want to be in the future. But there are other regions, other continents that are following as well. For example, China is not that far behind us at the moment. I know that the European Commission, they mentioned the goal that the complete all the cars in Europe must be zero emission in 2050. China announced, okay, we can do that better. We will have that in 2040 already. So there are quite some regions that are following as well.
Thank you, Yorien. And Rajiv, from your perspective in India, have you seen a follow through here as well, or is this something that's still evolving in terms of call it climate action tied to circular economy and remanufacturing?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if I may, I want to kind of take a sort of a step back and maybe dovetail a little bit into what David was saying from the standpoint of the 45% that comes from the product life cycle. And one of the most useful frameworks that I have seen to help me understand and visualize, how does this all fit together, is the 5 capitals framework that was brought forward by the Forum for the Future, where it's, natural capital forms the basis, and you've got social and human capital above that, and then the economy sits on top of that. And what we're seeing is that the activity that is occurring in the topmost part of the pyramid, so to speak, is fundamentally affecting the basis of civilization. And you simply can't ignore it. And at the same time, there's an invisibility to it in a sense. And what I mean by that is, for most of us, from the standpoint of looking at what we use or consume on a day-to-day basis, we're not really seeing or feeling or thinking about life cycle emissions. We look at it from the standpoint of utility of what we're using today in this moment, and it becomes a bit challenging then to think about, well, how do I conceive of that, and how do I make choices based on that, especially when that information is not easily available. And I think that challenge is also true for the folks that are in the industry, from the standpoint of looking at, hey, you guys need to think about, or we need to think about, the way we're even designing products so that carbon emissions come down. Sometimes that doesn't quite compute, and that can feel like a bit of a leap to go from, well, it's been fine so far, and we haven't seen too many effects personally, so we don't have to worry about it. And I think there's a danger in that illusion a little bit, and also because the life cycle element doesn't have a sort of overt visibility to it, it also becomes challenging to sort of think about, when you think about remanufactured products, for example, where you are by design bringing products back, giving them multiple life cycles, you've eliminated almost the preceding steps, the mining or raw material extraction, the logistics and transportation associated with that, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that needs to be, bringing it sort of from an India perspective. The conversation we had yesterday with folks from UNIDO, Invest India, the Department for the Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade. It was, I think, a wonderful beginning from the standpoint of bringing stakeholders, a diverse set of stakeholders together to talk about it more generally, but also it was clear that more needs to be done to establish those linkages in the mindset. I mean, obviously these linkages exist in reality, but I think there's a bit of a disconnect where there's not a clear understanding of what the value proposition is from the standpoint of remanufacturing or refurbishing and other modalities. Obviously, remanufacturing isn't the only one, but I think more, and we're excited about this in particular, is to do more of that, to engage with folks within government, those who straddle the spaces between government and private sector, as well as the private sector. And the positive, not to make it sound that enough isn't being done. It also does appear that remanufacturing is more widespread in India than we know of, and that was self-evident by virtue of two gentlemen that participated from Tata Motors, and they said, yeah, we've been doing this for about 2 decades, but just unheard of. And I think that's what I'm optimistic and hopeful about, is to bring more of this into the forefront of the conversation, and those examples, especially the ones that are working, that have been profitable, that have been doing this for a long time, I think bring a certain degree of assurance and confidence both to the individuals and organizations that may be interested but are uncertain about market acceptance, etc., as well as those in the policy space that are now in this position of, we need to create an environment where this happens more easily. And if there's already companies that are doing this that have worked without the intervention, then how can we magnify, amplify, and accelerate that, and what might be the steps that are needed? So let me pause there. But I think it's an exciting kind of inflection point that I see we're reaching here in India.
I don't think that India is the only one who's challenging our collective awareness that the end user is not really aware of remanufacturing. I know that, for example, in the USA and in Europe, remanufacturing exists already since 40-50 or something, and it still remained a niche. However, it always fits in that circular economy. So I think looking at the Dutch government, but I think also the rest of Europe in the world, and the circular economy is getting more and more important. However, remanufacturing is staying a bit behind on that. Only since the last couple of years you hear a bit more about it. But normally when people ask me what I do for a job or where I work in, I need to explain remanufacturing because no one really heard of it. And if you explain it, it's quite difficult to explain. So I think that's the challenge. I think that's number one challenge in remanufacturing is the awareness.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to quickly add to that also, what I've noticed is the tendency to lump all the modalities together. So remanufacturing, refurbishing, reconditioning, rebuilding, repair, recycling are in the mind of some folks one thing, right? And so when you talk about remanufacturing, you say, oh, that's just recycling, and it's really not. So in that, not to make it sound like an uphill challenge, but I think that the deliberate or intentional explanation, or whether it's a mass media campaign or bringing more granularity and having these kinds of conversations in the public square, I think are going to be very important, so that this sort of confusion or blurring of the lines between remanufacturing as a modality and recycling, which is essentially material recovery or material salvage, they're not the same thing. And just this morning I had an opportunity to clarify that on a LinkedIn post as well. So I think that's a good thing. I think to bring it out there and then to get the feedback saying, hey, is this really the same or not? That might be part of the journey, but I'm also, there's a part of me that goes well, this shouldn't take too long. And I think there's an urgency, especially from a climate action perspective. And I think it's important to magnify, amplify, and do this with an intensity quickly, and so that we can move to the point of, well, what now? What, where do we go in terms of policy and/or investment, product design, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think we're going the right way, and also the goals are pretty good. If you look at China, I think they started remanufacturing in 2008. They have now already reached the 30 billion mark, and I think in 2030 they want to reach 17.5 billion. And for Europe, but I think they've explained this a bit better. They have a goal of reaching 90 billion in 2030, if I'm correct, David.
That would do. If we get
goals are quite good.